I was 15 when my parents called me a waste and threw me out with nothing but a backpack. 23 years later, they showed up at my grandfather's funeral in matching Mercedes, demanding their cut of his $40 million estate. But when the lawyer smiled at me and said, "Only you know what this means," I realized my grandfather had been planning this moment since the day I knocked on his door as a homeless kid. My name is Flynn Calloway, and this is the story of how I went from sleeping on my grandfather's couch to inheriting everything my parents thought they deserved. But more than that, it's about discovering that the people who are supposed to love you can be the ones who hurt you most, and sometimes family isn't about blood at all. Let me take you back to where it all started, because you need to understand who these people are to believe what they did. My mother, Vivienne, was a real estate agent who sold million-dollar homes in the wealthy suburbs outside Cincinnati. She wore designer suits to open houses and drove a white Lexus that she washed every Sunday. Everything about her was polished, calculated, perfect. She could walk into a room and assess everyone's net worth in 30 seconds. She'd smile at the right people and ignore everyone else. That's who she was. Image meant everything to her. My father, Bernard, was an investment banker who managed portfolios for clients worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. He wore custom suits, carried a leather briefcase that cost more than a used car, and spoke in that careful way wealthy people do when they want you to know they're smarter than you. He checked his phone during dinner. He missed every school event I ever had because he was always in meetings. Success was the only thing he understood. They lived in this pristine colonial house with white columns and a circular driveway. The lawn was always perfect. The furniture was always spotless. Nothing was ever out of place. It looked like something from a magazine, and that's exactly what they wanted. A picture-perfect life. Then there was my younger sister, Paige. She was 3 years younger than me, and she was everything our parents wanted. Honor roll student, piano recitals, tennis lessons, the whole package. She wasn't a bad person, just terrified of disappointing them. She learned early that staying in their good graces meant following the script they'd written. And then there was me, the kid who didn't fit. I had dyslexia, though my parents never wanted to acknowledge it. They just thought I was lazy. School was torture. I'd stare at pages of text that seemed to move and blur, struggling to read what everyone else breezed through. My grades were terrible. I barely passed most classes. Teachers would call home, and my mother would get this tight smile on her face like she was swallowing poison. But I wasn't stupid. I just learned differently. I was good with my hands, good at figuring out how things worked. I could take apart a radio and put it back together. I could fix the electrical outlet in the garage that kept sparking. I loved building things, creating things, understanding how systems connected. My parents saw this as a character flaw. The only person who understood me was my grandfather, Walter, my father's father. He was everything my parents weren't. He'd built his construction company from nothing, starting as a day laborer and working his way up until he owned one of the most successful contracting firms in southern Ohio. He wore work boots and flannel shirts. His hands were calloused and scarred. He drove an old pickup truck that he refused to replace because it still ran fine. My father was ashamed of him. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. Bernard had spent his entire adult life trying to erase where he came from. He wanted people to think he was born into money, born into that polished world of country clubs and investment portfolios. Having a blue-collar father who showed up to family events in work clothes was an embarrassment to him. But Walter was my hero. Every summer, I'd beg to spend time with him at his job sites. He'd let me shadow the electricians, watching them wire new buildings, troubleshoot problems, install complex systems. He taught me that working with your hands wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. My parents hated this. Vivienne would say things like, "You're throwing away opportunities we've worked so hard to give you." Bernard would shake his head in disgust whenever I came home with dirt under my fingernails or electrical tape stuck to my shirt. They wanted me to be someone I wasn't. They wanted a son who'd go to an Ivy League school, who'd become a lawyer or a doctor, who'd make them look good at dinner parties. Instead, they got me. A kid who failed English class and loved rewiring circuit breakers. The breaking point came 3 weeks before my 16th birthday. I'd been caught cutting class to help Walter with an emergency electrical job at one of his rental properties. The tenant had called panicking about sparking outlets, and Walter needed an extra set of hands. I thought helping someone in an emergency was more important than sitting through a history lecture I'd fail anyway. My school called my parents. That night, I came home to find them waiting at the kitchen table. The look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Bernard spoke first. His voice was cold, controlled. "You failed another exam. You ditched school again. You're not even trying, Flynn." I tried to explain about the emergency, about helping Walter, but Vivienne cut me off. "We've given you every advantage. Private tutors, expensive schools, opportunities most kids would kill for, and you waste all of it to play handyman with your grandfather." "I'm not playing," I said. "I'm learning a real skill. I'm good at this." Bernard's face went hard. "You're not applying yourself because you don't want to be part of this family. You want to embarrass us. You want to throw away everything we've built." That's when Vivienne said it. The words that would replay in my head for the next 23 years. "You're a waste of everything we've invested in you." The room went silent. Even Paige, who'd been hovering in the doorway, gasped. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. My own mother had just called me worthless to my face. I went to bed that night feeling hollow. I didn't know it yet, but my parents had already made their decision. They'd had enough of their failure son. They wanted me gone. The next morning, I woke up to find 2 duffel bags packed and sitting by the front door. My clothes, my few possessions, everything crammed into 2 bags like I was being erased from their perfect house. Bernard was drinking coffee at the kitchen counter, reading the newspaper like it was a normal Tuesday. He didn't even look up when I came downstairs. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. He pulled out his wallet and counted out $200 in cash. He set it on the counter between us. "You want to work with your hands? Go figure out life without our money, without our support, without us." I stared at him, unable to process what was happening. "You're kicking me out? I'm 15. "You'll be 16 in 3 weeks, Vivienne said from behind me. She was already dressed for work, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Plenty of people make it on their own at 16. Maybe some real-world experience will teach you what we couldn't." I looked at Paige. She was standing on the stairs, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, frozen. "Get your things and go," Bernard said. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were empty. "We're done." I grabbed the $200 with shaking hands. I picked up the duffel bags, and I walked out the front door of that pristine colonial house, knowing I'd never be welcomed there again. I walked 6 miles to Walter's house, crying the whole way. My shoulders ached from the bags, my feet blistered in my sneakers. People in passing cars stared at the teenage kid stumbling down the sidewalk with everything he owned. When I finally reached Walter's small ranch house on the east side of town, I could barely knock on the door. My hand was shaking too hard. Walter opened it, took one look at my face, at the bags, at the tears, and he knew. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled me inside and wrapped me in a hug that smelled like sawdust and coffee. "They finally did it, didn't they?" he said quietly. I nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak. Walter pulled back and looked me straight in the eye. "You listen to me, Flynn. You're not a waste. You're not an embarrassment. You're a good kid who got dealt a bad hand with parents who don't know what matters. You can stay here as long as you need. But we do. This my way. You finish school, you work hard, you treat people with respect, and you never let anyone make you feel worthless again. Deal?" "Deal," I whispered. That was the day my real life started. The day I learned that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when everyone else walks away. I lived with Walter for the next 3 years. He helped me get my GED when traditional school became impossible. He taught me the electrical trade properly, paying for my apprenticeship and making sure I learned from the best electricians in his company. He showed me that honest work had dignity, that building something with your hands was just as valuable as any college degree. My parents never apologized, never checked in, never called to see if I was okay. Vivienne reached out once, 6 months after kicking me out, asking if I'd come to my senses about college. When I told her I was pursuing electrical work and loved it, she hung up on me. Bernard never called at all. Paige would sneak me texts occasionally, short messages like, "I miss you," or "I'm sorry." But she never stood up to them. She was too scared of becoming me, of being the next kid thrown away for not being perfect enough. I didn't know it then, but Walter was watching all of this, watching how my parents abandoned me, watching how they moved on with their lives like I'd never existed, watching how I kept showing up for him, working hard, building a life from nothing, and he was making plans. Plans that wouldn't come to light for another 23 years. Plans that would change everything on the day of his funeral when my parents rolled up in matching luxury cars, ready to claim what they thought was rightfully theirs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what those 23 years looked like. You need to understand the secret Walter and I kept, and why it mattered so much when that lawyer smiled at me and said, "Only you know what this means." Because this isn't just a story about money. It's about the price of abandonment, the weight of showing up, and the moment when karma finally catches up to the people who thought they could throw away their own child and suffer no consequences. Before I tell you what happened at that funeral, you need to understand the life I built after Walter took me in. Because the 23 years between being thrown out and standing in that lawyer's office weren't just time passing. They were years that defined who I became. I'm 38 now, living in a small 2-bedroom house on the east side of Cincinnati. Nothing fancy. The paint on the shutters is peeling a bit. The driveway has cracks I keep meaning to fill. My truck is a 2015 Ford F-150 with 160,000 miles on it. The passenger seat has a coffee stain I've never been able to get out completely. My toolbox sits in the truck bed, same one Walter gave me when I completed my apprenticeship 20 years ago. I work as a commercial electrician, same as I have for the past 18 years. I wire office buildings, troubleshoot electrical systems in warehouses, install industrial lighting. My hands are calloused and scarred. I've got a permanent tan line on my forearms from wearing work gloves. I smell like electrical tape and copper wire most days. I'm good at what I do, really good. My reputation means I never lack for work. My life is simple. I wake up at 5:30, make coffee in the same pot I've had for a decade, and I'm on a job site by 7. I work until 4 or 5, come home, shower off the day's dust and sweat. Most nights I make dinner, something basic like spaghetti or grilled chicken. I watch whatever game is on TV. I go to bed early because morning comes fast. I'm not wealthy. I make decent money, around $75,000 a year, which is comfortable but nothing extraordinary. I've got $22,000 in savings. My mortgage payment is $900 a month. I drive the same truck I bought used 6 years ago. I shop at the regular grocery store, not the fancy organic one across town. I cut my own grass. I fix my own repairs when things break. This is important for you to understand. I'm an ordinary guy living an ordinary life. I'm not special. I'm not remarkable. I'm just a man who learned a trade and built a quiet existence, and I was completely content with that. But my life looked nothing like what my parents had wanted for me, and that difference defined everything that came later. Let me take you back to my childhood so you understand just how far apart we were. I grew up in Riverside Estates, one of those suburbs where every house costs over $500,000, and everyone's lawn looks like a golf course. The kind of neighborhood where people judge you by your car and your job title, where status is currency and appearances are everything. Our house was a showpiece. 4,000 square feet of staged perfection. Vivienne decorated it like she was preparing for a magazine shoot. White furniture that nobody was allowed to actually sit on. Glass coffee tables that had to stay spotless. Fresh flowers replaced every week whether they'd wilted or not. The kitchen had marble countertops and top-of-the-line appliances that my mother barely used because we ate out most nights at restaurants where she could be seen. Family dinners, on the rare occasions we had them, felt like performance reviews. Bernard would ask Paige about her grades, her piano progress, her tennis matches. She'd recite her achievements like she was presenting a quarterly report. He'd nod approvingly. Vivienne would smile that practiced smile she used with her real estate clients. Then they'd turn to me, and the temperature in the room would drop. Bernard would ask about my grades with this edge in his voice, already disappointed before I answered. I'd mumble something about trying harder. Vivienne would get that pinched look around her mouth, like even acknowledging my failures physically pained her. The conversation would move on quickly, everyone pretending I wasn't sitting right there, a living reminder that their perfect family had a crack in it. I spent most of my childhood feeling like an intruder in my own house, like I was constantly apologizing for existing. My room was the only place I felt safe, and even that wasn't really mine. Vivienne had decorated it in blues and grays that she thought looked sophisticated. I wasn't allowed to put up posters or leave things messy. Everything had to match her vision. The only escape was summer visits to Walter's job sites. He'd pick me up in his beat-up truck, and we'd drive to whatever property he was working on that day. I'd watch electricians run wire through walls, install breaker panels, troubleshoot systems that weren't working right. Walter would explain everything, patient and encouraging in a way my parents never were. He'd say things like, "See how Jamie figured out that short circuit? That's problem solving. That's using your brain in a different way than school tests measure. You're smart, Flynn, just not in the way your parents recognize." Those words kept me alive during the years when I felt worthless, when I failed another test and saw the disappointment in my father's eyes, when my mother would sigh heavily and say she didn't know what they'd done wrong raising me. Walter's belief in me was the only thing that made me think maybe I wasn't the failure they said I was. But my parents saw my love of that work as rebellion, as rejection of everything they'd built. Bernard had spent his entire adult life climbing the social ladder, erasing his blue-collar roots, building this image of old money sophistication. Having a son who wanted to be an electrician like his grandfather was a personal insult to him. Vivienne was worse. She'd tell her friends I was exploring different interests or still finding himself. These vague phrases that let her avoid admitting her son was failing out of school and wanted to work construction. At parties, she'd steer conversations away from me entirely. I became the family secret, the thing we didn't talk about. Paige tried to be neutral, but she was just a kid trying to survive the same house I was. She learned to be what they wanted because she saw what happened when you weren't. She got praised, got attention, got love. I got lectures and disappointment and eventually got thrown away. The night they kicked me out, I think part of me had been expecting it. Not consciously, but somewhere deep down I'd known I was living on borrowed time. That eventually their embarrassment would outweigh whatever parental obligation they felt. That I'd become too much of a liability to their carefully constructed image. What I didn't expect was how easily they'd do it. How Bernard could hand me $200 like he was tipping a valet. How Vivienne could check her reflection in the mirror while telling me to leave. How little I'd apparently mattered to them all along. Walter saved my life that day. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but by opening his door and treating me like I had value. By giving me rules and structure and expectations, yes, but also giving me something my parents never had. Unconditional acceptance of who I actually was. I became who I am in that small ranch house, learning electrical work beside my grandfather, discovering that my worth wasn't determined by test scores or my parents' approval. I built a life I was proud of, even if it was simple, even if it was ordinary, and I had no idea that 23 years later, that simple, ordinary life would collide with my parents' world in a way none of us saw coming. Walter opened the door that day and pulled me inside without hesitation. He didn't pepper me with questions or make me explain what happened. He just knew. That night, sitting at his kitchen table with hot chocolate he'd made because he didn't know what else to do for a crying teenager, he laid out the ground rules. You can stay here as long as you follow my rules. You finish high school, you work hard, and you treat people with respect. That's it. Nothing complicated. Can you do that? I nodded, still unable to speak without my voice cracking. Walter leaned back in his chair, studying me with those sharp eyes that never missed anything. Your father and I haven't been close in a long time. You've probably figured that out. He's ashamed of where he came from. Ashamed of me. He wanted to be someone different, someone important. That's his choice, and I've made peace with it. But I won't let him make you feel like honest work is something to be embarrassed about. Over the next 3 years, Walter became more than my grandfather. He became my father in every way that mattered. He helped me get my GED when traditional school became impossible. He paid for my electrical apprenticeship out of his own pocket. He taught me not just the technical skills of the trade, but the character it required. Show up on time, do quality work, treat clients with respect, keep your word, simple principles that my actual parents never bothered teaching me. During those years, I barely heard from Bernard and Vivienne. That one phone call from my mother 6 months in, asking if I'd come to my senses about college, was the only real contact I had with them. When I told her I was pursuing electrical work and actually loved it, that I was good at it, she went silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know what we did to deserve this," and hung up, like my happiness was a punishment inflicted on her. Bernard never called at all, not once. Not to check if I was alive, not to see if I needed anything, not even out of basic human decency. I was dead to him. Paige would text me occasionally. Short messages that said everything and nothing. I miss you. Mom and Dad don't talk about you anymore. I'm sorry I didn't say anything that day. But she never invited me to anything. Never suggested we meet up. Never stood up to our parents on my behalf. She'd chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. What I didn't know then was that Walter and Bernard had been estranged long before I came into the picture. One night when I was 19, working on a wiring project in Walter's garage, he told me the truth. Your father was embarrassed by me his whole life, Walter said, not looking up from the circuit diagram we were studying. When he went off to college, he told people his father was in real estate development. Technically true, I suppose. I developed properties by building them, but he made it sound like I wore suits and attended board meetings. When I showed up to his graduation in my work clothes because I'd come straight from a job site, he barely acknowledged me. Walter's voice stayed steady, but I could hear the hurt underneath. He married your mother, and she encouraged that distance. They'd invite me to holidays, but only the big ones. Christmas, Thanksgiving, and they'd always seat me at the far end of the table, away from their important friends. Like I might say something that would give away their secret. I hadn't known any of this. I'd thought the distance between Walter and my parents was just normal family drift. Why didn't you tell me before? Because you were dealing with enough, Walter said simply. You didn't need to know your father's been running from his roots his entire adult life. But now you're older, and you should understand. This isn't about you, Flynn. Your father was always going to reject anyone who reminded him of where he came from. You just had the misfortune of being interested in the same work I do. That conversation changed how I saw everything. My parents hadn't thrown me out because I was a failure. They'd thrown me out because I represented everything they were trying to escape. When I was 23, Walter sat me down with an expression I'd never seen before. Serious, almost scared. I need to tell you something, and I need you to keep it between us. Nobody else can know. Not Paige, not your parents, nobody. Can you promise me that?" "Of course," I said, suddenly worried. "What's wrong?" "I went to the doctor last week for that persistent cough I've had. They ran tests." Walter's hands were clasped tightly on the table. "I've got heart disease, advanced. The doctors say I've probably had it for years, but it's progressed now to where it's serious. They're giving me 15 to 20 years if I'm lucky and take care of myself." The words hit me like a physical blow. Walter was only 59. He seemed invincible, still working job sites, still strong and capable. There has to be something they can do. Surgery, medication, something. "There is medication and I'll take it. But this isn't curable, Flynn. It's manageable, but it's going to get worse over time." He reached across and gripped my shoulder. "I'm telling you because you live here, and you'll notice things. Doctor appointments, medications, days when I'm more tired than usual. But I don't want your father or Vivian to know. I don't want Paige to know. Do you understand why?" I thought I did, but I asked anyway. "Why?" "Because they don't call unless they need something. They don't visit unless it's obligatory. If they know I'm sick, if they know I'm dying, they'll suddenly become attentive. They'll start showing up, playing the concerned family. And it won't be because they care about me. It'll be because they're circling, waiting to see what they can get when I'm gone." The bitterness in his voice was painful to hear. "You really think they'd do that?" "I know they would," Walter said firmly. "Your father has never cared about me as a person, only as a resource, only as something to either use or be embarrassed by. I won't give him the satisfaction of pretending he loves me when I'm dying, and I won't let him pressure you about it either. So this stays between us. Promise me, Flynn." "I promise," I said, and I kept that promise for the next 15 years. Watching Walter's health slowly decline over those years was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Some days were good, some days he could work a full shift, crack jokes with his crew, be the strong man I'd always known. Other days he'd be exhausted by noon, needing to sit down, catching his breath after climbing a single flight of stairs. I took over more and more of the business operations. Walter trained me not just in electrical work, but in management, contracts, client relations. By the time I was 30, I was essentially running the electrical contracting division of his company. Walter still made the big decisions, still showed up when he could, but I was the one keeping things running day to day. And through all of it, Bernard and Vivienne remained distant. They'd call on Christmas, a perfunctory 10-minute conversation where Bernard would ask how the business was doing, and Walter would give vague answers. They'd visit maybe once a year, always leaving after an hour with excuses about other commitments. They never asked how Walter was feeling. Never noticed he'd lost weight or moved slower. Never cared enough to look beyond their own world. Paige got married to a corporate lawyer named Derek when she was 27. I wasn't invited to the wedding. I found out about it 3 weeks later when she texted me a photo of her in a white dress, saying she wished things were different. I didn't respond. What was there to say? She'd fully adopted our parents' lifestyle by then. Big house in the suburbs, luxury car, country club membership. She'd become them, and whatever connection we'd once had as siblings was gone. The years accumulated like layers of sediment. I turned 30, then 35. Walter turned 70, then 75. His hair went completely white. His hands trembled, sometimes when he held tools. The medication kept him stable, but we both knew we were living on borrowed time. I moved more of my work schedule around his needs. I started sleeping in his guest room 3 or 4 nights a week, just to be there if he needed anything. We'd have dinner together every night I stayed over, watching baseball games or old westerns, not talking much but comfortable in the silence. Bernard and Vivienne's annual visits became even shorter. They'd show up on Christmas afternoon, stay for exactly 90 minutes, exchange obligatory gifts, and leave. They never asked Walter about his health, Never noticed the pill organizer on his counter or the way he'd pause to catch his breath. They were so wrapped up in their own lives that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. When Walter turned 78, things started declining faster. He'd have good weeks followed by bad weeks. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed without help. I hired a part-time nurse to check on him during the days when I had to work. I rearranged my whole life around making sure he wasn't alone. On a Sunday evening 3 months before he died, Walter called me into his study. He looked tired, older than I'd ever seen him. "Sit down, Flynn. We need to talk about what happens after." "Don't talk like that," I said automatically, even though we both knew this conversation was overdue. "I'm 79 next month. I've got advanced heart disease. We're not pretending anymore." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've made arrangements. Leonard Hutchins has been my attorney for 30 years, and he's handling everything. My will is updated. Everything is in order." "Okay," I said quietly, not sure where this was going. "Your father is going to be upset. So is Vivian. Probably Paige, too, though she might hide it better." Walter watched my face carefully. "They're going to feel entitled to things they're not getting. And they're going to blame you." "Why would they blame me?" Walter smiled, sad and knowing. "Because you're the one who was here. You're the one who kept the secret. You're the one who showed up without expecting anything in return. And that's going to make them look very, very bad when the truth comes out." I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could ask, he continued. "I've watched them for 15 years, Flynn. Watched how they treated you after they threw you out. Watched how they treated me, their own father and grandfather. They call once a year. They visit out of obligation. They've never asked about my health, never wondered why I've slowed down, never cared enough to notice I'm dying." His voice cracked slightly on that last word. "But you've been here. Every Sunday dinner for 23 years. Every doctor's appointment for 15. You kept my secret not because I promised you anything, but because I asked you to. Because you're a good man who keeps his word. That matters, Flynn. That matters more than they'll ever understand." The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in early September. I was at a job site running wire through a new office building when my phone rang. It was Walter's nurse, her voice shaking. "Flynn, you need to come now. He's gone. I came in to check on him this morning, and he'd passed in his sleep." I don't remember the drive to his house. I don't remember parking or walking inside. I just remember standing in his bedroom doorway, looking at him lying peacefully in bed, and understanding that the most important person in my life was gone. The nurse had already called the coroner. I sat with Walter until they came, holding his hand, crying quietly. He looked calm. No pain on his face. He'd died the way he'd wanted to, at home, in his sleep. I was listed as his next of kin on all his medical documents. I'd been the one making his medical decisions for the past year, so I was the one who had to start making calls. The funeral home, the coroner, his business partners, his friends, and then the call I'd been dreading. I dialed Bernard's number, my hand shaking. He answered on the third ring. "Flynn, why are you calling from your grandfather's phone?" "Dad." The word felt strange after so many years of barely speaking. "Walter passed away this morning, in his sleep, peacefully." There was a pause. Then Bernard said, "I see. When did this happen?" "The nurse found him around 7 this morning. I've been here since 8. "All right, thank you for letting me know." His voice was controlled, businesslike. Then, before I could say anything else, he asked, "Did he leave instructions about the estate? Is Leonard Hutchins still handling his affairs?" My stomach turned. Walter had been dead for 3 hours, and Bernard's first question after the basic facts was about money. "Yes, Leonard is handling everything. I'm arranging the funeral according to Walter's wishes. I'll let you know the details once they're finalized." "Fine, we'll be there." He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in Walter's kitchen, staring at my phone, feeling sick. He'd been right. They hadn't asked how I was doing, hadn't expressed sadness or shock or grief. Bernard's first concern had been the estate. I spent the next 3 days planning the funeral. Walter had left detailed instructions in a folder in his study, right where he'd told me they'd be. He wanted a simple service at St. Michael's Chapel, the small church he'd attended occasionally. He wanted his construction crew there, the electricians he'd trained, the people who'd actually known him. He didn't want anything fancy or expensive. Don't waste money on a show, he'd written. Give people sandwiches and let them tell stories about me. That's all I need. I followed his instructions exactly. I called his old friends, men in their 70s and 80s who'd worked alongside him for decades. I called the electricians from his company. I arranged for simple flowers and a modest reception. And then came the day of the funeral. I arrived early, standing outside the chapel in my only suit, greeting people as they arrived. Walter's friends came in pickup trucks and modest sedans. They hugged me, told me stories about working with Walter, shared their grief openly and honestly. Then I saw them. 2 silver Mercedes SUVs, identical models, pulling into the parking lot in formation like some kind of procession. The vehicles were immaculate, gleaming in the September sun. Probably $80,000 each. Bernard and Vivienne stepped out of the first one. Bernard wore a charcoal suit that probably cost $3,000. Vivienne wore a black designer dress and heels so high she had trouble walking on the gravel parking lot. They both wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Paige and her husband Derek emerged from the second SUV. Paige wore a black dress with pearl jewelry. Derek was in an expensive suit, checking his phone immediately. They looked like they were attending a fashion show, not a funeral. Every person there could tell these weren't people who'd come to mourn, they'd come to be seen mourning. Vivienne walked up to me and pulled me into a stiff hug that lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Oh, sweetie, we're so sorry for your loss." Her voice had that practiced sympathy she probably used with clients, completely hollow. Bernard shook my hand formally. "Your grandfather was a good man. This is a difficult day." The funeral service was exactly what Walter wanted. Simple, honest, filled with people who'd actually known him. His old construction buddies told stories about job sites from 40 years ago. One of the electricians I'd trained with talked about how Walter had given him a chance when nobody else would. The pastor, who'd known Walter for 30 years, spoke about a man who valued character over status. Bernard and Vivienne sat in the front row because they were family, but they looked uncomfortable the entire time. Vivienne kept checking her watch. Bernard's face remained blank, unreadable. They didn't cry. They didn't react to the stories. They just sat there waiting for it to be over. During the reception afterward, they made a brief appearance, shaking hands with a few people, offering generic condolences. Then Bernard pulled me aside near the coffee table. His voice was low, businesslike. "When is the will reading? Leonard Hutchins is still the executor, correct?" I wanted to punch him. My grandfather had been dead for 4 days, and this was what he cared about. "Tomorrow, 10 in the morning at Leonard's office." Vivienne appeared beside him, having clearly been listening. "We'll be there, of course. It's important for family to be together during these legal proceedings." She said it like she was doing me a favor. Right, family. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. They left 30 minutes later, citing other commitments. Paige gave me an awkward hug before following them out. "I really am sorry, Flynn. I know you and Grandpa were close." I watched them drive away in their matching Mercedes, and all I could think was that Walter had called this exactly right. They'd shown up for appearances, stayed the minimum amount of time, and immediately started circling the estate like vultures. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went to Walter's house, walking through rooms that felt empty without him. Every corner held memories. The kitchen table where we'd done electrical diagrams. The living room where we'd watched 1,000 baseball games. The study where he'd told me about his diagnosis 15 years ago. I found myself standing in that study, looking at his desk. There was an envelope sitting in the center with my name on it in Walter's distinctive handwriting. My hands shook as I picked it up. Inside was a letter dated 1 week ago. He'd known he didn't have much time left. Flynn, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I want you to know that having you in my life these past years has been my greatest joy. You became the son I wish I'd raised, and I'm proud of the man you've become. Tomorrow will be difficult. Your parents will show their true nature. They always do when money is involved. But I've made arrangements. Trust Leonard. Trust yourself. And remember, real wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in knowing who you are and living with integrity. The secret we kept wasn't just about my health. It was about seeing who would care for a dying old man when there was nothing obvious to gain. You passed a test you didn't know you were taking. With love, Walter. I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face. He'd been watching. All those years he'd been watching to see who showed up, who cared, who was there for the right reasons. And he'd made his decisions accordingly. The next morning, I arrived at Leonard Hutchins' office 15 minutes early. The reception area was all dark wood and leather furniture, the kind of place that screamed old money and established law. Leonard's secretary offered me coffee. I accepted but couldn't drink it. Bernard and Vivienne arrived exactly on time, like this was a business meeting they'd scheduled. Vivienne had changed into a black suit with subtle pinstripes. Bernard carried a leather portfolio. Paige trailed behind them, looking uncomfortable. They barely acknowledged me. Vivienne was touching up her makeup in a compact mirror. Bernard was scrolling through his phone. Paige sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap. Leonard emerged from his office at exactly 10 o'clock. He was tall, probably 6'3", with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Everything about him projected competence and authority. "Thank you all for coming. Please, follow me." We filed into the conference room. Leonard sat at the head of a long mahogany table. A thick folder sat in front of him, Walter's name embossed on the tab. I took a seat on one side. Bernard, Vivienne, and Paige sat, on the other side, a clear physical division that felt symbolic. Leonard adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. Walter Calloway's estate is substantial. As you may know, his net worth at the time of death was approximately $40 million. This includes the construction business, various commercial and residential properties throughout Ohio, investment portfolios, and liquid assets. Vivienne sat up straighter. Bernard leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with interest. Even Paige looked more alert. Leonard continued, his voice measured and professional. Walter was very specific about his final wishes. He updated this will 4 times in the past 15 years, most recently 6 months ago. Every version contained the same core instructions. He wanted me to make clear that these decisions were not made lightly, hastily, or under any kind of duress or influence. He looked directly at me. He wanted me to tell you all that he'd been watching. Carefully, for a very long time. Bernard shifted in his seat. "What does that mean?" "It means," Leonard said calmly, "that Walter spent 15 years observing how his family treated him and each other. He documented everything. Phone calls, visits, conversations. He kept detailed records because he knew his decisions would be questioned." He pulled out a pair of reading glasses and looked down at the document. "I'll read the relevant portions now. I, Walter James Calloway, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this my last will and testament. I have 1 son, Bernard, and 2 grandchildren, Flynn and Paige. Over the past 15 years, I have observed my family carefully. I have seen who showed up when there was nothing to gain. I have seen who cared for an old man, not his bank account." The room went completely silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Leonard's voice was steady as he continued. "Bernard, my son, you were ashamed of me your entire adult life. You built your existence pretending you came from money, embarrassed by your blue-collar father. You called once a year out of obligation, always asking about the business, never about me. You visited only when socially required. You never asked how I was, never wondered about my health, never cared about anything except what I was worth. To you, I leave $10,000. Use it to buy something that reminds you of what you lost when you chose status over family." Bernard's face went from pale to deep red. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "That's impossible. This is ridiculous. I'm his only son. This will is obviously invalid. He wasn't in his right mind." Leonard held up one hand. "Mr. Calloway, I need you to let me finish. Interruptions won't change anything, and I have a legal obligation to read this in full." Vivian's mouth was a thin, tight line. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fury in her eyes. Leonard continued. "Vivian, you married my son and adopted his shame. You threw out your own child because he didn't meet your standards of success. You showed me exactly who you are. To you, I leave nothing. You have taken enough from this family." Vivian stood up abruptly. "This is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. We'll contest this immediately. You can't just— Mrs. Calloway, please sit down." Leonard's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I understand you're upset, but there's more." Vivian sat down slowly, her hands trembling with rage. Leonard waited until she was settled before continuing. "Paige, you were young when your brother was cast out, and I don't blame you for not standing up to your parents then. But you're an adult now, and you've had 23 years to make things right. You chose comfort over courage. To you, I leave $100,000. It's enough to build a relationship with your brother if you choose to, or enough to forget him if that's easier. The choice is yours." Paige's eyes filled with tears. She stared down at the table, her face crumpling. Leonard's voice softened slightly as he reached the final section. "To Flynn, my grandson who became my son, who kept a secret, that asked nothing and gave everything, who showed up not for inheritance but for love. To Flynn, I leave the entirety of my estate, the business, the properties, the investments, all of it. $40 million, give or take, depending on final valuations." The room exploded. Bernard shot to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "This is fraud, undue influence. He was dying. He wasn't thinking clearly. Flynn manipulated him." Leonard's expression turned cold. "Walter was examined by 3 separate physicians in the 6 months before his death. All confirmed he was mentally competent. I have their signed statements. He was sharp until his last day. This will has been reviewed and approved by 2 independent attorneys. It's ironclad." Vivian turned on me, all pretense of civility gone. "You manipulated a sick old man. You convinced him to cut out his real family. You're pathetic, Flynn. You've always been pathetic." I finally spoke, my voice shaking but steady. "I didn't know about any of this. I never asked Walter for anything, not once in 23 years. That's exactly why you're receiving everything," Leonard said firmly. He reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Walter gave me specific instructions for this moment. He knew you'd react this way. He knew you'd accuse Flynn of manipulation, so he prepared something." Leonard slid the envelope across the table to me. My name was written on the front in Walter's handwriting. "The will mentions a secret kept safe. Walter wanted me to present this to Flynn in front of all of you. Flynn, only you know what this means." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper dated 15 years ago, 1 week after Walter's diagnosis. The words blurred through my tears, but I read them. "Flynn, by the time you read this, you'll have spent years taking care of a dying man. Not for money, you don't even know this letter exists. Not for recognition, no one knows I'm sick except you. But because you're a good person. That's who you are. Your parents threw you away for not being what they wanted. But you're everything a man should be. You kept my secret. You kept showing up. You earned every penny you're receiving. Not through manipulation, but through character. Be proud of yourself. I am. Walter. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I just held the letter and cried. Leonard's voice cut through my grief. Walter told me that if anyone questioned Flynn's integrity, I was to read this aloud and present the documentation he'd prepared. Should I? Bernard was already backing toward the door. This doesn't change anything legally. We'll contest it. We'll tie this up in court for years. Leonard smiled, and it wasn't friendly. You're welcome to try, Mr. Calloway, but you should know that Walter had me document every interaction with his family for 15 years. Every phone call, every visit, every time you left early or couldn't be bothered to check on him. He kept a detailed journal. He even recorded some conversations. Everything is admissible and has already been filed with the probate court. He slid a thick binder across the table. You abandoned Flynn when he was 15. You ignored your father unless you needed something. You showed up to his funeral in $80,000 vehicles and immediately asked about money. It's all documented. You can spend your resources on attorneys if you want, but Walter's will is airtight. Flynn will inherit everything. Bernard grabbed Vivian's arm. We're leaving. Our lawyers will be in touch. You're welcome to try, Leonard repeated calmly. But I've been practicing estate law for 37 years. This is the most thoroughly documented will I've ever handled. Walter knew you'd fight this, and he prepared accordingly. They stormed out, Vivian's heels clicking angrily on the hardwood floor. Paige stood slowly, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me, opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then just shook her head and followed our parents out. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone with Leonard in the silent conference room. Your grandfather loved you very much, Leonard said gently. He planned this moment for years. He wanted your parents to see exactly what their choices cost them. The next 6 months were a blur of legal proceedings. Bernard and Vivienne did hire attorneys, expensive ones. They contested the will on grounds of undue influence, diminished capacity, and fraud. Every single challenge failed. Leonard had been right. Walter's documentation was thorough, his medical records were clear, and the court found absolutely no evidence that I'd manipulated him. In fact, the judge made a pointed comment during the final hearing. The evidence shows that Mr. Flynn Calloway was unaware of his grandfather's intentions and never requested or expected any inheritance. The fact that he spent 15 years caring for a terminally ill man without knowledge of financial benefit actually proves the opposite of manipulation. It proves genuine love and character. Bernard and Vivienne were ordered to pay court costs. They'd spent over $200,000 on legal fees trying to break the will. They'd lost everything, including the $10,000 Walter had left Bernard, which went to cover additional court expenses. I didn't gloat, I just felt empty. They'd proven everything Walter had said about them. They'd spent more money fighting for what wasn't theirs than Walter had actually left them. Paige reached out 3 months after the court ruling. She asked to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something in her message felt different, genuine. We met at a small cafe on the east side. She looked tired, older than her 35 years. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said immediately. I was a coward. I watched them throw you out and I said nothing. I had 23 years to make it right and I didn't. Grandpa was right about me. Why now? I asked. Because I can't live with who I've become, she said quietly. I turned into them, Flynn. I married someone like Dad. I built a life just like theirs. And when I saw how they acted at the funeral, how they fought over Grandpa's money like vultures, I finally saw it. I saw what I'd become. And I hated it. We talked for 2 hours. She told me she'd started therapy, that she'd separated from Derek, that she was trying to figure out who she was beyond our parents' expectations. I didn't know if I could trust her, but I appreciated that she was trying. Walter had given her a choice with that $100,000. She chose to try. That meant something. I kept the electrical contracting business, hiring a manager to run daily operations. I still work as an electrician sometimes because I genuinely love it. The $40 million didn't change who I am. It just gave me options. I used $2 million to establish the Walter Calloway Apprenticeship Fund. It provides full scholarships for young people from difficult backgrounds who want to learn skilled trades. Every year, it helps 15 kids get training in electrical work, plumbing, carpentry, or construction. Kids like I was. Kids who need someone to believe in them. I bought a nicer house, nothing extravagant. I upgraded my truck. I took a month-long trip to Alaska, something Walter and I had always talked about doing together. I donated to St. Michael's Chapel and to the hospice care facility that helped during Walter's final months. Mostly, though, I just kept living my life. Bernard and Vivian haven't spoken to me since the court ruling. I heard through Paige that they tell people I stole Walter's money, that I manipulated a dying man. Their friends don't believe them, but it makes them feel better to have someone to blame besides themselves. I don't care what they think anymore. They threw me out at 15 because I wasn't what they wanted. Now I have everything they thought they deserved, and they can't stand it. But this was never about revenge. Walter didn't leave me his estate to hurt them. He left it to me because I was there. Because I cared, because I showed up for 15 years without expecting anything in return. On the 1-year anniversary of Walter's death, I opened his second letter, the one Leonard had given me that day. It was full of specific advice about the business, the properties, the investments. But at the end, Walter had written something that still makes me cry. Flynn, you're probably feeling overwhelmed. Maybe guilty about having so much when you didn't ask for it. Don't. You earned this by being a good person. You earned it every Sunday dinner, every doctor's appointment, every time you checked on an old man who was lonely. Money is just paper and numbers. What matters is what you do with it. Use it to live well. Use it to help others. Use it to prove that success isn't about status or appearances, it's about character. Make me proud, you already have. I think about that letter every day, about what Walter taught me, about the difference between wealth and worth. My parents built their entire lives around status and appearances. They threw away their own son because he didn't fit their image. But Walter taught me that real success is simpler than that. It's about showing up for people you love. It's about doing honest work. It's about keeping your word. It's about being there when it matters. I was homeless at 15, sleeping on my grandfather's couch with everything I owned in a backpack. Now, I'm worth $40 million. But that's not what changed my life. What changed my life was learning that I had value even when my parents said I didn't. Walter saw something in me they couldn't see. He saw past the failed tests and the dirty fingernails and the disappointment. He saw me. The secret I kept wasn't just about Walter's illness. It was about showing up without expecting anything in return. About being family when it's hard, not just when it's convenient. My parents showed up at his funeral in luxury cars demanding their share. I showed up for 15 years asking for nothing. That's the difference. Real wealth isn't what you own, it's who you are when nobody's watching. It's the person you choose to be when there's nothing to gain. Walter knew that. And he spent 15 years making sure I knew it too. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me what Walter's lesson means to you. And subscribe to the channel because I've got more real-life stories that'll make you think about what really matters in life. Thanks for watching, and remember, character always outlasts cash.